the research that we put out today, as I said, timing is almost everything in anything that you do in life, and we think that we've made a pretty reasonable contribution to the debate around global networks and how business in Australia needs to embrace what really is a global village, and how through the current arrangements in terms of our trade agreements and so on can work to the advantage of Australia. What we've said is that, there's no doubt that these trade agreements, the free trade agreements or the Trans-Pacific Partnership in themselves are going to be good for Australia. There's no doubt about that. However, and having done it myself in the past, politicians tend to trumpet perhaps a little loudly just how successful that's going to be before the ink is actually dry on those agreements. And as you know, as was the case with the TPP, whilst countries have signed up to it, all 12 of them that have signed up to that particular document, it still has to be ratified in the various parliaments and congresses in those countries before it comes into law. Now, the concern we have about that, of course, is that if you follow American politics, and who doesn't, I mean, Donald Trump, what are you going to say? But look, if you do follow American politics, you will see, for example, one of the leading contenders for president in Hillary Clinton has gone completely the other way now in terms of whether she supports the TPP or not. She's saying no. And there is a considerable rump on the hill in Washington that are of a similar mind. So it's not a lay down misere yet that the TPP, for example, will be ratified by the United States. But what we've said is that, yes, it's important, and in our research you will see there are contributions that have been made that have said approximately 0.4% contribution to the growth of Australia's GDP from the free trade agreements when they are fully embraced, which itself might sound a bit small but can be quite considerable. But what we've also said is that all of these that have been put together, whether it be the most recent one with China, whether it be the most recent one with Japan, whether it be the most recent one with Korea, or whether it be the TPP itself, they are, in terms of economics, very, very significant. But the concern that we've raised in our report is that we need to have an overarching and embracing formal trade policy developed. We haven't had one where there's been a trade statement for over 20 years in this country. And whilst governments of different persuasions, and don't forget they take a long time to negotiate these FTAs, 10 years, etc. So what we've got in place now started many governments ago with different people as prime ministers and have now come to fruition. And they take a long time to negotiate, and we have said that therefore an overarching policy framework should be put in place where we, as consumers in Australia, can see what the fundamental principles behind that are. We've also said in our report that it would be nice if those fundamental principles were espoused for each and every one of the particular trade agreements that were being looked at. Why have we said that? Well, you only have to look last week at what happened. When the final documentation associated with the TPP was released, a group of people concerned with environmental issues immediately raised concerns as to why there wasn't enough said about locking in some of those principles in this final agreement. And what we have been saying is that governments could avoid criticism of the process if in fact they were a little more embracing at the start. If the secretive nature of those agreements was perhaps put to one side at the beginning, yes, the detail of the negotiation has to be done behind closed doors. That's a given. But I think the fundamental principle should be there so that we all understand what it's about. We've also said, of course, that some of the provisions that are in the documents that come out and are ratified by parliaments that enable companies to sue governments of other jurisdictions who are parties to those free trade agreements may in fact be a bit of a mistake. And until I think people examine in greater detail, for example, the TPP and what that means, although I must admit Minister Rob has said that he seems to have that under control, it may well be the case of where tobacco companies are suing Australia because we've got packaging and no labelling on cigarette packages and so on, as being a restraint on trade. These sorts of issues, I think, have to be examined, and therefore our report makes mention of that. We've also been a little controversial in one sense, and that is that we've made some suggestions that where we currently have a free people movement agreement between Australia and New Zealand, perhaps that's something that we could look at extending a little further afield. And we've said in the first instance it might apply to Singapore. Singapore is a highly developed economy. The idea of movement of people between the two economies based on skill, based on training, based on the needs of each economy is something that we think could be examined. Naturally, of course, there would have to be the employment safeguards that people have spoken about, and which, of course, the government and the current opposition have had some deliberations over when it comes to CHAFTA. We think something like that is worthy of examination as well. But at the end of the day, this report is about giving some succour and comfort to the view that free trade agreements are important for Australia, no doubt about that. However, their importance will only be measured by the way in which parts of the Australian economy embrace them. And for that, and particularly in our panel discussions, we're going to be talking about particularly small business. If you think that 80% of Australians are employed in this country in the services industries, if you think the vast majority of businesses in this country are small to medium-sized enterprises, if you think that it's less than 2% of Australian small businesses are engaged in China, our biggest market, then you have to start to think about how is it that the free trade agreements and how is it that EFIC and Austrade and other entities associated with the federal government can assist in promoting small and medium-sized business to embrace the global supply chain, because it is that way in which they will become engaged. And with the tariff barriers coming down through the free trade agreements, this will be the way in which small business can see opportunities. But there's a risk in it, and they have to be encouraged to take that risk because the benefits are going to come from Australia. Now, I know we've all seen on television and heard the radio ads about free trade agreements going through and people are employing people already and so on and so forth. Well, all good, all good. And let's see that translate into some real changes for Australia. And our view would be that, of course, you need to measure that at some stage in the future. I know that occasionally ad hoc committees of the Federal Parliament get put together to examine these free trade agreements before they are then ratified by the Parliament. I have a view that perhaps those committees, in fact, should be put together simply to also, over 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, do something of a stock take to see just how effective those free trade agreements have been. What has been the genuine economic contribution to Australia's growth by those free trade agreements? And I think it's the Federal Parliament's role to do that. And that, in fact, could be a subset of what I said earlier, the overarching trade policy statement that talks about what governments of this country want to see from its trade policy. It could be an important subset of that. So look, the document itself, it's a page-turner. It contains some wonderful recommendations. It contains, on one hand this, on the other hand that. Minister Rob very graciously consented to write a chapter for us on CHAFTA and how important free trade agreements are. Some of the other contributors have perhaps raised some issues associated with the apparent secrecy provisions associated with the negotiations that I've already spoken about. But more generally, and I think it goes without saying, we have already seen benefits of the global village in which Australia operates. Professor Peter Dawkins, the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University, is going to perhaps address some of these issues. The way in which international students have embraced Australia from all around the globe. But at the end of the day, as he will say, and as I know, having been a Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at his institution recruiting international students, the fact is that we're not having this conversation alone. People in the UK, in the United States, all around the globe are having a similar conversation about what does this all mean. And as we pointed out in our piece of research in June of this year on the future of work and the interrelationship between what's happening around the globe and digital disruption and where computerisation is going and so on, the skill levels that we have to train people for are also going to make Australia an attractive destination if we get those skill level training opportunities right. So there's a lot in this, and our report examines that, and we talked about international students being great ambassadors once they go back to their home countries, having been given a first-class Australian education. All of that is an important part, again, of what we think is this global network and how you do business from this country. There are challenges. There's no doubt about that. And I think these become critical when you think that we seem to have at the moment bipartisan support for the free trade agreements. Now the by-election in Western Australia is out of the way. The Labor Party's jumped on board, as I knew they would. So everything's sweet and rosy in the world at the present moment. So that in itself is a critical dimension of why free trade agreements become so important. If you get all sides of the parliamentary system that matter signed up to these things, and that the measurement of the benefits that flow can be part of an overarching trade policy that perhaps both sign up to, then again the spirit of bipartisanship is going to translate into economic benefit for this great nation.